If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Black Lives Matter!
This weekend made very clear that a former police officer's acquittal in a first-degree murder case touched a deep nerve within St. Louis.
We've marched in the streets. We've had a civil rights movement. We've elected a black president. We've had a women's suffrage movement. We've had all these rights movements, and then these things still happen.
Judge Timothy Wilson's decision to acquit Jason Stockley of the first-degree murder of Anthony Lamar Smith triggered waves of protests throughout St. Louis. The vast majority of demonstrators were peaceful, but some people broke windows in the region's business districts, and scores of people were arrested on Sunday night. The verdict is putting the spotlight on Missouri Governor Eric Greitens, who harshly criticized the political response to Ferguson during his successful campaign. He's trying to deliver a two-pronged message. Protesting Stockley's acquittal is okay. Smashing windows and assaulting police officers is not.
We need to find ways to bridge the gap, bring law enforcement officers and clergy together, and I'm really proud of the work that we've done thus far, and we're going to continue that work.
Still, some elected officials are calling Greitens and St. Louis Mayor Lyda Krewson's leadership into question. More than anything, people like State Representative Bruce Franks feel it's unrealistic for people to feel at peace with the judge's decision.
There's a difference between being peaceful and being nonviolent. But just to let you know, there will not be any peace. Because one thing that has to be understood, and that will be understood, is y'all gonna stop killing us.
On this edition of the Politically Speaking podcast, Joe Mannies and I examine the response to Stockley's acquittal. We also talked with Republican Representative Rob Vescovo about his perceptions of the unrest and what his GOP colleagues plan to do about it next year. So let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, a candid conversation with the Show Me State's biggest political newsmakers.
I'm Jason Rosenbaum.
And I'm Joe Mannies.
That's Eric Greitens, Navy SEALs running for governor, and I'm really, really glad to be on with you, Jason and Joe.
I'm going to push back on these regulators.
I'm doing this for the people.
I was encouraged along the way, not just by my family, but by a lot of teachers and professors, and knew when I was in college that I would run for office someday.
We're very excited about the prospect of having some more free market solutions.
Even though after the conversation, I still might not agree.
We want our listeners to get a real sense of what drives these people.
They're actually people with a story to tell. And welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in studio today is
colleague Joe Mannies.
And before we get to our guest, State Representative Rob Vescovo of Jefferson County, Joe and I wanted to talk a little bit about the aftermath of the verdict of Jason Stockley. And I'm not only wanting to talk about this because it's in the news right now, but because a place that is home for me and has been home for my family for many years, if not decades, is now under the national microscope, and that is St. Louis. And for people that don't know, Jason Stockley is a former St. Louis police officer who was tried for first-degree murder of an African-American man named Anthony Lamar Smith. This happened in 2011, the actual police-involved shooting. And last Friday, a judge ruled that he was not guilty of first-degree murder, which set off a wave of protests throughout St. Louis. There were some instances where windows were smashed. Dozens of people have been arrested. And I think most importantly for St. Louis, the image of the city is taking a big hit. Joe, you've lived in the St. Louis area longer than I've been alive.
That's true.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are about this entire situation.
Well, without getting into the judge's verdict or why the judge did what he did, one can read it. There's two things. First, the city of St. Louis in particular really took a hit, not just because of the protests, but because of the cancellations of some high-profile events, especially the U2 concert, which I think actually helped gravitate some national attention, not good national attention, on the city. Because basically when you have major events like that canceled, the image is that the St. Louis is not safe.
I do want to play my feature that aired earlier today on Monday, September 18th. It's about how Missouri Governor Eric Greitens and St. Louis Mayor Lyda Krewson are handling the protests. Here it is right now. It's Saturday afternoon, and Governor Eric Greitens is getting coffee in the Central West End, where the night before, some businesses' windows were broken during protests.
The fact is, violence and vandalism is not protest. Violence and vandalism is a crime. And we told people, if you throw bricks, if you throw bottles, we're going to throw you in jail.
Greitens is trying to separate himself from how Democratic Governor Jay Nixon handled protests in 2014 over Michael Brown's shooting death in Ferguson. For instance, Greitens is establishing a clearer chain of command by putting the St. Louis Police in charge, with St. Louis County, the Highway Patrol, and the National Guard ready to assist. That's a change from the protests that followed Brown's death, when multiple law enforcement agencies were in charge. He's also held a news conference with Anthony Lamar Smith's fiancée, Christina Wilson, and met with religious leaders.
We need to find ways to bridge the gap, bring law enforcement officers and clergy together, and I'm really proud of the work that we've done thus far, and we're going to continue that work.
Because Brown was killed in St. Louis County, then St. Louis Mayor Francis Slay played a somewhat supporting role to Nixon and the St. Louis County executive. That's not the case for Krewson, who's in charge of speaking up for her city and is heavily involved in how police respond to protests. Unlike Greitens, Krewson has been an elected official in St. Louis for nearly 2 decades. She says she's aware of the racial and economic divides.
The issues being protested are real impediments to the success of our city.
It's perhaps too early to tell if Greitens and Krewson's words are having an effect. The vast majority of protesters have refrained from violence or vandalism, but people did break windows and throw objects at police officers throughout the weekend, leading to dozens of arrests. Supporters of the protest movement, like Felicia Steyer, say both Greitens and Krewson set unrealistic expectations that people would respond peacefully to the acquittal of Stockley, a white former police officer who killed a black man.
I think governmental officials underestimated the level of outrage that people are having around the verdicts. It's just so heavy, and I think it's really hard to understand that if you haven't been affected.
State Representatives Michael Butler and Bruce Franks have criticized Greitens for not meeting with younger activists who are organizing the protests. St. Louis Sheriff Vernon Betts says talking with young people, like how he did before Friday's verdict, is better than meeting them with riot shields or pepper spray.
They are a less patient group than we are, and so we need to spend more time sitting, listening to them and trying to understand their desires and trying to work things out.
St. Louis Treasurer Tashara Jones barely lost to Krewson in this year's mayoral election. She says she hopes the Stockley verdict compels elected leaders to re-examine the criminal justice system. State and local politicians passed relatively few laws in response to Ferguson.
There are tons of cities that are improving their criminal justice system that stop arresting people for being black or poor or sick or on drugs. If we don't take this moment again, here we are again 3 years later, and make some significant changes, we're going to continue to see this happen over and over and over again.
It'll be up to Greitens and Krewson to decide if they'll take a similar public policy course. So, Joe, I want to talk about 2 things before we get to our guest. The first is how Governor Eric Greitens has handled the protests and how St. Louis Mayor Lyda Krewson has handled the protests. It's 2 kind of separate situations, but They're both kind of linked because they're both handling the same thing. I want to start with Greitens in particular because during his successful gubernatorial campaign, he was extremely critical of Democratic Governor Jay Nixon and to some extent Attorney General Chris Koster for how they responded to Ferguson.
You also have to, in a very concrete way, give people an outlet for their anger and their fear. And what I would have said, Jason, I would have said, look, first, we're going to put on a dusk to dawn curfew. We're going to create a situation of security and stability. There's a dusk to dawn curfew. And when the sun goes down, and I'll tell you, I was on the street as the sun went down, and you could see mothers and kids leaving the crowd and drunk guys walking in. What I would have said is when the sun goes down, I am going to be in this church. And I'm going to be there with the mayor. I'm going to be there with the chief of police. I'm going to be there with any church leaders who are willing to join me. And I will stay there until the sun comes up, and I am willing to listen to and to hear from anyone who's hurting, who's on the front lines.
That hasn't happened yet. I think putting a curfew in the city of St. Louis would be extremely difficult given how big the city is. But with all that as a backdrop, and given that we are 2 or 3 days into this, what are you hearing from people about how the governor has handled this entire situation?
Well, and I want to emphasize, we're not talking about the specific event, but his reaction to it.
Yes.
Okay, he has a military background, and I think that is showing very much in how he is responding to the police, how he's dealing with the highway patrol, how he's looking at the situation. Now, so far, as you mentioned, he has not fulfilled some of his comments that he made when he was a candidate, but that was a year and a half ago, and things can change once you're governor and you're looking at things on the ground. So while some of the activists may not be that keen on everything that the governor has been doing or what he's been saying, I think there's two things that are without dispute. One, he is extremely engaged in making sure that everybody sees that he's engaged. And B, this event, whether one likes it or not, it does highlight his background as a military man where he has been in situations where a lot of people feel that they're under siege.
Unlike Jay Nixon, Governor Greitens has been in St. Louis before the verdict and after the verdict. After the Michael Brown situation, Jay Nixon did not come to the St. Louis area for a few days. I understand that the two situations were different. Governor Greitens had a month to prepare to this, and the Michael Brown shooting was kind of an out-of-nowhere event.
Yeah, and it happened on a Saturday.
But it should be noted that is a legitimate difference between the two.
Yes.
But I have heard from some elected officials, as I mentioned in the feature, that all this emphasis on peacefulness and making sure the protests are peaceful kind of missed the point. That the point of protest is not necessarily to follow certain guidelines or rigid mores, so to speak, but it's also to express anger and actually disrupt everyday life. I want to make it clear that many of the elected officials that I've talked to have repeatedly emphasized that they do not support vandalism or violence, and that's not what they're trying to do. But they are trying to disrupt the ordinary flow of life in St. Louis, and they don't think that Governor Greitens really gets that. What do you think about that, Joe?
Well, that may be true, but I think you have to look at it from Greitens' perspective, and I'm not justifying it. I'm just looking at through that lens. He's looking at what and to some degree the mayor is too, about the national image that's being created by all this, and also the longer-term impact. With ignoring the issue that ignited the protests, it's a fact. There has been a strong economic impact. It's hurt a lot of businesses. It could mean that some people lose their jobs, at least temporarily. And in many cases, these may be people who are also some people who are, they're middle class or lower class, they're minimum wage jobs that are being most affected by the protests and by the issue of the protests. So my point being that it becomes very complicated while you, as part of protests, you're trying to disrupt things. It also means that some of the people you're trying to help may also be some of the people who get hurt by this.
I want to talk about Lyda Krewson, too. Now, I don't want to say that Lyda Krewson ran for mayor saying that I'm going to handle a Ferguson-like event better, but she did run for mayor saying that we are going to keep St. Louis neighborhoods safe, or at least make them more safe than they actually are. I even asked her at one of her press conferences, does that make that campaign pledge even more important about how she handles this? This is what she had to say.
My desire to increase public safety in St. Louis is increased, if anything, by this moment. And I think that, we have the opportunity to do that.
So what do you think is at stake for Mayor Krewson here? This was a situation, the Anthony Lamar Smith shooting, where she wasn't mayor at the time, but she has to bear a lot of the consequences, and a lot of attention is on her leadership right now.
Yeah, I think one thing that will be important for her is it's not just communication, which she's been putting out like Facebook videos and other things, she sometimes with the chief to say, okay, here's what happened today. But she also has to demonstrate, and again, she has to demonstrate that she is a strong leader. And sometimes and I'll be candid, sometimes for women in major offices, they have a fine line. They want to project strength, but they don't want to come across as something else or not showing that they're thoughtful about things. So she's trying to, I think, show that she's strong, but that also she can listen and that also that she's understanding of what some of the issues are. And that can be really complicated. I mean, it's complicated for anybody who's mayor, but especially when you're new, even though she's been around St. Louis politics for decades, it still means that because if she looks like she's not keeping control of the situation, it can affect her effectiveness on other issues.
So we're going to dive right into our interview this week. It's with State Representative Rob Vescovo. He is a Republican from Jefferson County. We're going to get to the rest of his interview later in the show, but we did talk with him about his reaction to the Stockley verdict, and we're going to hear his thoughts about that right now.
The three of us sitting in this room, we don't know what the judge saw. We have no idea what evidence he saw. We weren't privy to any of that information. I don't believe any of the public was privy to that information. I'm not going to contradict what the judge's decision was, but I will tell you what a lot of people feel. Protesting, that's great. I believe in that. But when it gets violent, when it turns the way it has, when we go down the lane of property damage, and if you'll look at one of the tweets I put over the weekend, which was, along the lines of, bringing violence or bringing property damage only taints our attention to your cause.
Yeah, and just to make sure we're ultra specific, to those who wish to riot, our officer LEOs have families too. If you raise violence, it will only tarnish our attention to your cause. Continue.
And I truly believe that. I'm going to pay more attention to your issue when you come and talk to me about your issue, when you protest your issue to me, when, it's like in the Capitol. Listen, do you know how many people I heard from about right to work? Everyone is welcome in my office. Democrats, Republicans, independents, I don't care who you are. I talk to every one of my constituents or people that even aren't my constituents. Mm-hmm. I will listen to your cause and understand your cause more if you're speaking to me about your cause rather than spitting in my face or tearing my room up or throwing things aside.
I do want to just point out, because, and I haven't been in the streets that much, I will say the majority of protesters have been peaceful. There have been people that have broken windows
Sure.
and thrown things at police officers. I mentioned that in my story today. I do want to ask, though, do you think that Republicans can separate the people that are being disruptive and from the people that are being violent and breaking the law? Because I've heard people say, like, you shouldn't conflate the two because they're basically two separate groups of people. What's your thought on that?
Well, how do you separate them? How do you figure out who's left from the march and who's left for the window breaking? We can't separate that. All I know is I'm watching from home, just so you know, working with my family, working in the yard. Yesterday we we cleaned our garage. It was awful. But, then we go and we sit down on the couch, my wife and I last night on Facebook, and we had, probably 10 friends of ours who their wives are commenting about how their husbands are going through these issues downtown. And that goes back to what I said. We have families also. The things that, you're going through on your side, it's an understanding, right? None of us ever know what we're going through, right? You don't know what I've gone through, what personal experience or life experience I've gone through. But at the end of the day, how you handle yourself is going to determine how much I understand.
I'm going to play an audio clip now from Neil Bruntrager, who's the attorney for Jason Stockley. And he brought up a point. It's a little bit lengthy of a clip. It's about a minute, that I actually think is pretty instructive about the legislative response that I'll ask our guest about when it's over.
Under the facts of this case, there really could not have been a lesser offense. It was either murder in the first degree or it was nothing. And of course, that's what Judge Wilson made the determination of here. You have to also understand that in this instance, even though the allegation was murder in the first degree, we successfully injected the issue of self-defense. And self-defense in regard to a police officer is something that is determined not by state law, but determined by the Supreme Court of the United States, and basically they lay out exactly what must happen, and it imposes upon the state a very difficult burden. And the state must then prove not only that you committed murder in the first degree, but that you didn't act in self-defense. In a way, it sort of makes them prove a negative. And that's a very, very tough burden to meet. Again, that's not something that's established by state law. That's established by the Supreme Court of the United States. And Judge Wilson applied that here. He said they didn't meet that burden. They didn't prove that he didn't act in self-defense. Therefore, he acted in self-defense. And if you acted in self-defense, that would eradicate or eliminate any need to consider any of the lesser included offenses.
I understand that you're not an attorney, but you would have you are voting on every bill like everybody else. I played that clip because I think that there have been calls to re-examine self-defense regulations that police officers can use. With that backdrop in mind, that a lot of this is governed by federal court precedent and not state law, would you say it's going to be a difficult battle for Democrats to achieve any changes to that sphere of influence?
Well, here's what I'm going to say, and I may stray off of where you want me to go.
Sure, that's okay.
But I want to point out that I take no position in this case. I don't know. All I know is what the judge has said, and I have not even read whatever his judgment is. I take no side on either issue. Now, what you just played said it's more of a federal issue from the Supreme Court and not the state level. Well, my first thought, if to be fair, is maybe these protesters should be reaching out to Lacey Clay or someone that represents parts of what they want to see changed, right? At the federal level, not the state level. Maybe that's where they need to take their issue. But again, I take no side in this issue. I have not read the verdict, and I know nothing about this issue other than what you see or I see on the news.
I'm glad that you pointed that out.
So do you, with your views in mind, do you see where the General Assembly, at least the Republican majority, which frankly are huge in both chambers, the Republicans call the shots, where your fellow Republicans and Republican leadership would tend to take a similar view that, hey, A, this is based on some federal laws, and B, this is more complicated than it appears, and C, we're not going to do anything that signals that we support any form of property damage. I'm just laying that out there. I'm not taking sides.
Sure. So, again, I am not in leadership. I'm not sure of leadership's position. I know that we have heard some things in the past. Some things have come through committee. I sat on civil and criminal proceedings for my first 2 years, and I'll tell you, we did hear some things. So it's not as if we aren't taking action on them. Lots of bills die. Republican bills die. I had bills die this year. It's actually quite hard to get things through both chambers and onto the governor's desk.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, your personal and professional background, and how you got involved in the wacky world of Missouri politics.
So I met my wife. We bought a house. We lived in the city for a couple of years.
Now, where are you from?
I grew up in Manchester, Chesterfield area. The mean streets of Chesterfield.
The mean streets of Chesterfield.
Okay, so the magic question.
Sure.
Where'd you go to high school?
So I went to Fern Ridge. I attended Parkway West for a little bit, and then I went to Fern Ridge, which is a Parkway school district.
Okay.
All right, continue.
So we didn't have a big enough house in the city, and we looked for some property, and we looked towards Jefferson County. A lot of our friends went to St. Charles, but I found what I liked in Jefferson County, so we bought a couple acres out there, and we built a home. I built a home, and that's where we ended up.
What made you choose Jeffco over St. Charles? I'm curious about that.
I had met many people from Jefferson County over the years, and the attitude, I enjoyed the attitude, the candor with people, you stay out of my business, I'll stay out of yours. Just let me live my life, and you live your life. And I like that attitude. I did enjoy the scenery as you could drive down New 21 or New M. It truly is beautiful, and that's how we ended up picking it.
Yeah, new 21 has made a big difference.
Absolutely.
And just so folks understand, that really was the result of, I mean, you can say things good or bad about Dick Gebhardt when he was the congressman, but the new 21, he made that possible.
Sure. Some of our roads used to be called Blood Alley.
Yes, and that part was, yes. He changed that whole area. If you looked at it, let's say 20 years ago, totally
That's right.
different.
No, that'd be good.
So you first ran for office in 2014, or did you run before then?
Actually, I've run for office many times.
Oh.
I ran for Jefferson County Council in 2010.
Okay.
My wife had a very difficult childbirth months leading up to that, so I didn't get to campaign, and I did lose eventually in the primary. I ran for Jefferson County Assessor. I lost in a primary. So, when I ran for state representative, I was 0 for 2, and I thought it was the right decision to take that step as well.
And spoiler alert, you ended up winning that primary, but not by very much. I think you won by 9 votes.
8 votes.
8 votes, even smaller than I imagined. And I guess in this instance, the Republican primary was the election, although I have to say Jefferson County is historically Democratic, but I think that your district might be slightly more Republican than some of the historically Democratic ones. Is that fair to say?
I would agree with that, but I wouldn't just say Republican. I would say independent.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking for a candidate that fits the district, fits them. So yeah, it was a tough primary. We battled quite hard, and I admittedly had no name recognition, none at all. I was definitely the third candidate.
And one of the interesting things about your campaign that I've heard from other people is while some other Republican candidates from Jefferson County campaigned against right to work or for labor issues, I think that during your campaign you told potential voters that you were for a right to work and that you were in favor of some laws that may seem detrimental to labor unions. First of all, is that true? And if so, why did you decide to take that tack, besides the fact that you believe in those issues?
So it is true. For me, honesty is the best policy, right? I wanted to be able to look voters in the face and tell them that was what I was going to do, that I was in favor of that law. And just to add note to that conversation at the door, my first campaign, including the primary, I knocked 16,000 doors. We did have that conversation quite a bit, but it always came back to, listen, Rob Vescovo, I am pro-worker. I always have been pro-worker. I'm pro-labor. But one thing I definitely am not, I am not pro-leadership of these unions. I see things differently and I believe the voters in my district see the things that have been done to them as well.
Now, just a little backdrop here. Jefferson County, like St. Charles County, has a number of people who are in labor unions or are retired labor unions. That's why this is even an issue. So
correct.
Proceed.
Correct.
So you ended up winning that general election in 2014.
20 points.
20 points. And then in 2016, I think that you were targeted by the Democratic powers that be. And how much did you win by?
I've always been targeted.
How much did you win re-election by the way?
20 points.
20 points. So it seems like you voting for right to work and being not in lockstep with labor leadership, as you mentioned, wasn't detrimental to your political prospects so far. Why do you think that is? Because it would seem that doing that in Jefferson County may seem counterintuitive, but is it a situation where voters just appreciate your honesty and your openness about it and they don't have to guess what you're going to do, essentially?
Well, I do think it's multiple things. I mean, what voter doesn't appreciate the honesty at the door? We may disagree on 80% of the issues, but disagree on 20% of the issues, but we do agree on the other 80% of the issues. One thing in my reelection, and one thing I've always done, when someone calls me, I return from the Capitol, I return all my own emails. When you get an email back from me, that's me. I return all my phone calls. When you get a phone call, that's me on the other line. One thing that people understand about me in my district is I am a working class guy. My wife and I, we drive 2 cars that have over 200,000 miles on them. You just saw me pull up in my 2001 Lincoln Navigator. It has, over 250,000 miles on it.
I did see this, by the way.
We live paycheck to paycheck, just like a majority of the people that live in my district. when I hear of something going wrong or someone upset with a position I've taken, I call them and tell them why I've taken that position. Back to right to work, the Teamsters sent out mailers in my district in my first term that said, our pension's going to fail, and Rob Vescovo is part of it because he voted for right to work. Well, right to work last year was vetoed by the governor, which, by the way, the Republicans tried to put it on the ballot. But it was vetoed by the governor. Those letters still went out, and look at the pensions that have failed. Look at the Teamsters pension. It's $17+ billion underfunded, and I had nothing to do with that. You know what I did? I went and sat in those retired Teamsters kitchen tables in their homes, in their garages, on their driveways, and said, listen, I had nothing to do with your pension. I had Teamster members that had been, maybe 15, 20 years until they get to retire out of their pension that have begged me to vote for right to work. Listen, I love my union, but I can't imagine paying another 15 years into this pension fund and I'll never see anything out of it. That was a strong position for me to take, and I will take that all the time.
Now, what do you see, shifting gears a little bit, what do you see as the key issues in your district? I mean, aside from the one we just discussed, especially now we've got, several months before the General Assembly goes back into session. What are you hearing?
I will tell you that my district, we're very pro-life. We are pro-Second Amendment. Typically, even our independents and our Democrats, we just want to be left alone. We don't want the government at every corner to tell us what's good, what's bad for us. We don't want the government to decide or tell us how we're going to put food on the table for our families. We want less red tape. We want those jobs that we continually talk about or hear about. We do want to remove those impediments. We truly do want to see the government get out of the way so that we can grow our families and grow our homes and our assets the way we see fit.
Now, some would say, just playing devil's advocate here, that having less government regulations on a number of issues, that somehow is then, how does that fit in with the effort to curb access to reproductive rights? How does that? How do those
you call them
things?
Access to reproductive rights. I call it abortion.
Well, I'm just being. I am not advocating one or the other. I'm just trying to use non-volatile language. But
sure.
Go ahead.
And I would tell you that my district and I believe my county fully support the positions I've taken on reducing abortion. We want to see abortion gone, and that's no doubt about Jefferson County.
And, would you press for some sort of state constitutional amendment, or kind of how do you see things playing out in the next session or two?
I don't have the answers to that. I am not in leadership, but I have a different view on it, and I don't know if you know this. I'm adopted, so I take it on a little bit more of a personal level. You see this quote from Ronald Reagan on billboards all the time now. Everybody against abortion's already been born. I'm going to tell you I take that same position.
I want to ask you this. I know you're a Republican, but there is this kind of internal battle going on within the Missouri Democratic Party about whether they should fund candidates and support candidates who are opposed to abortion rights. I know that you're not going to give Democrats advice on what they should do, but I am curious, as somebody who feels very strongly on this issue, do you think that the Democrats will have trouble gaining ground in the General Assembly if they have a hard and fast litmus test on this issue?
I don't have the answer, and I'm not going to tell them how to run their campaigns.
I was really trying to get you to tell them how to run their campaigns. But it does seem like, the reason I asked that question is I think the reason why Democrats were able to win often in Jefferson County is they took socially conservative positions on gun control and abortion. I've talked to many Democratic state reps from Jeffco over the years. Ron Casey is an example, who is very much opposed to abortion rights and voted with Republicans on major bills. So it seems like once those types of legislators either termed out of office or were defeated, they're replaced by Republicans who kind of feel the same way. And I guess maybe this is a question you can answer. Do you think that maybe happened in Jefferson County because voters kind of see Democrats, regardless of their views on this issue, as too corresponding with the National Party, who obviously have a pretty hard and fast litmus
So
test.
not just the national party, but at a state level. The sentiment in Jefferson County is that Democrats tell one thing at the door and then go to Jefferson City and vote a completely different way. People from Jefferson County they're very smart. They do pay attention. They know when they're being lied to. They know when they're told one thing and they hear something completely different. They do know how to go onto these websites and look up votes that are taken.
As we talked about at the beginning of the show, the legislature passed right to work, which, by the way, we haven't done this yet, but we always want to make sure we describe what right to work is. It is shorthand to describe a policy that would ban unions and employers from requiring workers to pay dues as a condition of employment. It passed. It is not currently in law because it's going up for a referendum next year, most likely. But there were other things passed this year, including I think a curtailment of project labor agreements, which you handled personally.
Correct.
Before we talk a little bit about what's going to happen next year, explain what that is and why you think it's important, your bill that you ended up handling.
So that was one of the first bills I filed when I came into the legislature, was project labor agreements, banning the use of project labor agreements across the state. I think that project labor agreements are unfair. I think that we needed to do away with them. We've got contractors that are taxpayers that live in specific areas where these jobs may be going on, and they're not allowed to bid on these projects. And if they do bid on these projects or want to bid on these projects, they have to become signatory for the length of that contract. For me, I think that's some form of extortion. I think that all taxpayers should be able to bid on jobs that are funded by the taxpayers.
Now, one of the contentions as far as on the other side, as far as project labor agreements, was that A, it set certain standards, B, it barred any sort of union company disputes. And there are some of the advocates who say, well, what's going to happen is that it's going to be out-of-state non-union firms who come in and bid on the business, and that they'll be undercutting non-union local firms. Do you think that the legislature needs to put in language to make sure that it's Missouri companies that bid on these contracts first, or do you think it should be free market?
I think number one, it should be free market. Number two, I think that's all talking points from any side you look at it. The talking points are ridiculous. These union companies can still bid on these projects. We did nothing to take away their ability to still bid on these projects. And you know what? There's so much favoritism, they probably still will win these projects. But all I'm doing is stripping away the fact that they can't be the only ones to bid on these projects, that you have to let merit shop contractors bid on these projects. And it's imperative to have competition. PLAs put that wall up to where they didn't have competition, and now they will. And I think that when you talk about the public's money, everyone should be able to fight for the public's money.
Looking forward a little bit, with the referendum kind of hanging over legislators' heads, do you think the fact that right to work is going to be put up for a vote may actually compel Republican lawmakers to pass more bills that didn't get passed this year, whether it deal with automatic deduction of union dues, whether it deal with prevailing wage? Could it actually backfire on labor unions because it may actually make it so more things are passed that they don't like? I know it's too early to say, but I have heard other people make the argument that could happen next year.
The battle for some of these things is going to continue. Fairness and public construction was one of them, and we got it done this year. I think you're going to still continue to see, paycheck protection. You're still going to see an effort to pass those issues because they're legitimate issues. Is it going to backfire? Time will tell.
Time will tell. So looking forward a little bit past this issue, you are running for House Majority Floor Leader.
I am.
When is that election, by the way?
So I don't know. I haven't gotten official word from the
Because
Senator.
I think some of it depends on whether Mike Searpoy wins his Senate race. If for some reason the Democrat upsets him, he would still be in the House and still be House Majority Leader. If he wins, and he is favored to win because that district leans Republican. I don't want to say he's automatically going to win. I'm just putting it out there. It's possible that leadership position might become open sooner than expected. So I guess I want to know why you're running for that position and what do you think you bring for the job?
So my experience in the legislature has been very thorough since I've been there. I don't know if my first couple of years I worked on project labor agreements. I worked on paid administrative leave, the abuse of paid administrative leave. I target good government bills. This year I worked again on project labor agreements. I worked on general obligation bonds and the way that bonds are bid in the state. It used to be negotiated, and now with the effort of myself and my colleagues and my being able to explain to them the process, we were and reaching across the aisle, we were able to get general obligation bonds and how they were bid across the finish line. I'm not working on things that are trying to separate one party from the other. I truly reach across the aisle. Why am I running? I'm running because I want to lend my experience to other people. You know, if you're to look at some of the seats that we talk about Jefferson County being a battleground, right? Nobody knows that is a battleground the way I know that's a battleground, and the way that Dan Shaw knows that's a battleground, and the way that Becky Ruth knows that's a battleground. We fight hard to get into the legislature. Kevin Corlew fights hard to get into the legislature. He wants to be successful while he's there. We all want to be successful. I've been able to champion my projects across the finish line with no help from lobbyists, no leadership giving me. I've never been given anything from leadership as far as bills are concerned. I've never been given anything from a lobbyist. Everything I work on is good government projects, things that I know I can get across the line, and I champion them through the House. My positions are explained on a daily basis, and I champion them through the Senate. Through relationships that I've made, style that I've made. My father told me when I was younger, my father, I used to watch him at 6 a.m. He would be on the phone. He was a home builder here in St. Louis, and he was always on the phone at 6 a.m. Rob, you can't let other people make your destiny. You have to make it for yourself. And so that's my style of politics in the building. I don't particularly enjoy a lot of the riffraff. You're going to get a straight answer out of me, a yes or a no. I want to see the Becky Ruths, the Kevin Corlews, the Chuck Bazies. I want our entire caucus, and quite frankly, people on the other side of the aisle as well. I want people to be successful. My experience that I have in the building, I want to be able to share that with them and say, listen, let me help you champion the things that you don't know how to champion. Let me help you. The other thing that I believe is, we're a building of different temperaments, talents, and convictions, right? If you want to talk about labor reform, you can talk to Rob Vescovo. If you want to talk to me about tort reform, don't talk to me about tort reform. I know enough to get myself in trouble. I rely on people like Kevin Corlew or Kevin Austin. I go and ask them questions. Hey, this is your area of expertise. Or Jay Barnes. Tell me what's truth, what's fallacy, and then I bring those interpretations in and make my decision on what I think is best for my position.
I should have asked you about tort reform just so I could get a.
Again, I know enough to get myself in trouble.
Well, we want to thank you for coming on the show. Just for our listeners, you are running against Representative Kirk Matthews, who we had on the show last year. We're going to try to get him on before the leadership happens, just for fairness. For all of our stories, stlpublicradio.org. Follow me on Twitter at Jay Rosenbaum. Follow Joe on Twitter at
Jay Mannies. That's Jmannies.
And you can follow the representative on Twitter or any other parts of the World Wide Web on
at Rob Vescovo.
How do you spell your last name, by the way?
V as in Victor, ESCO, another VO.
It's important to make sure people know how to spell it. Until next time, so long.
Thank you.
Something stirring in a deep Atlantic trench. Doesn't forget the 1,000 years before it slipped. It's the beast, it's my heart, it's so brave.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer, St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on The Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.